thank you guys for taking the time this evening to catch up with us. Look, what we wanted to do is we're going to keep tonight really short and sweet. Most of our seminars and evenings kind of run, for a very long period of time. This is a really, really short evening where we're just going to run through a common question that we get asked quite a fair bit with, which is, hey Josh, hey Nathan, like I've got a bit of equity. How do I actually use it? What is equity? So a lot of clients have built a lot of equity and they kind of go, hey Josh, but how do we actually access it? What do we do with it? What does it mean? So it's a very, very, common question we get asked. So we thought we'd run this evening purely as a bit of an informative evening with regards to how people, including both Nathan and I, have actually used equity to purchase multiple properties. Look, most people think you just got to come up with a cash deposit every single time, and that's not the case.
Yeah, and it's as Josh sort of said then, it's the quickest way to obviously build out your portfolio. If done correctly, it means that you don't have to worry about that savings plan. You can skip all that and really just sort of compound and leverage off good investments.
Yep, absolutely. All right. So look, before we kick off, guys, I don't know if the actual video or the noise is going to come through. You'll have to let me know. But here's an ad that actually stuck in my mind for many, many years now. This is from 2001. And it relates to equity. And so it's a Commonwealth Bank ad. So I'm going to play it and just let me know if you guys can hear it. Because again, I don't know if it's going to come through Zoom.
It's a holiday, mate. Come here with the guys. They could go on holiday house. Makes sense.
Investment property at home loan rates. You won't regret unlocking the equity in your home. Conditions apply. Which bank will make it happen?
So many of you might remember Equity Mate as like a catchphrase of the early 2000s, but essentially it is, yes, so very Greek, Shane. So, so essentially, this ad is enabled, I think it's Farouk from the castle to basically access the equity in his home to buy a holiday house. Now, we're not saying that's the wrong thing to do, but obviously accessing equity to build out a portfolio is what we strongly encourage. This is a concept that's been around for, obviously, now this is an ad from 2001, but now 21 years. So again, how do we actually use that equity? What is it? We're going to go through that right now. No, I don't want to play that again. Just give me a sec. There we go.
So I guess going back over the last couple of years, we've all seen some significant growth, particularly in the Australian property market. Looking at the stats and the data now, you've got $9.9 trillion worth of money tied up in the Australian property market. So it's a massive amount of money. And as these property prices keep growing, the overall value of the Australian property market continues to grow as well. We've seen over the last sort of 3 years, in obviously the last, sort of 12 months, significant growth where we've added about 512.6 billion in value in the last 3 months, or 5.7 billion a day from September 2021.
It's huge.
So astronomical sort of figures with the way the market's run recently. And what we've seen is obviously property prices or dwelling prices soar about 23.7% nationwide over the last 12 months to December. So a lot of people that have had property or that are building currently and they've got themselves into the market are looking at substantial increases in their property values. And that's obviously tied directly to equity growth in the property and then your ability to utilize that equity for subsequent purchases down the track. So obviously, why is this important to you? It means that we've got equity in our properties, okay? So we'll go through how we can use it and how it all sort of works. But obviously with those stats there, it gives you some sort of an idea that a lot of people in Australia are now implementing this strategy because they've got the money there, they've got the equity, and now it's how to unlock it and use it.
And look, on a side note, obviously we've seen 23.7% capital growth nationwide. And this is another seminar for another evening, but we genuinely believe, and we've got, very good stats to back it up, that while you're not going to get 23.7% over the next 12 months, we don't think that's going to be the case. You're still going to see growth in certain areas. So we'll leave that for another seminar. Alrighty, so what is equity in the simplest of terms? Equity refers to the current market value of your home, which won't necessarily be the price you purchased it for, minus the amount of money still owing on the home loan. So in the simplest of terms, what is the value of your property right now? What do you actually owe? And the difference is that actual equity. Okay, so in this example, I've got, hey, I own a property worth $800,000. The money you actually owe to the bank is $400,000, so the difference is $400,000. Now, that's the equity you have in the property, okay? So again, it's quite a simple calculation. So, many of our clients here this evening will be able to go and actually go, okay, brilliant. My place is worth $800, log on to your internet banking and see what you owe. And then it's very quick calculation to determine how much equity you actually have. Now, the tricky part is, can you actually use that equity, which we'll go through in a tick, and how much of it is usable?
Yep.
Alrighty.
So again, as Josh sort of alluded to then, $400,000 of equity in that scenario, but you can't actually use the full amount of the equity, okay? So we've got what we call equity and then what we call usable equity. So usable equity is what the banks will allow you to use as a deposit for your next investment loan or your next property purchase. Most banks will allow you to use up to 80% of your property equity, okay? So in the scenario that we just ran through, if your home is valued at $800,000 and we have a $400,000 loan owing as your mortgage, you can work out the usable equity via the below equation. So we're looking at an $800,000 value. We times that by 80% or 0.8%. And then we're looking at $640,000 as our finished price. So that means that we've got minus our $400,000 or minus our $400,000 loan that's existing, we've therefore got $240,000 of usable equity. Okay.
So what we'll go through shortly is then, with regards to the equity, how do we actually use it? So, yes, you've got total equity of 400,000. You can't use all of it because the bank still wants to keep a nice 20% buffer in the value of the property. So again, the 240 is basically what they're happy to release to you as equity. Okay.
And most of you would have gone through that as well with when you first initially purchased your property. A lot of the time, first-time investors utilize a 10% deposit and then they pay the lender's mortgage insurance because they haven't got that 20%. So now that the property's gone up in value, we've paid down a little bit of the loan. The banks want to retain that 20% so that we don't push ourselves back into that lender's mortgage insurance territory, and that we've also got a bit of skin in the game. So the banks are happy to lend again.
Absolutely. So how can you actually use equity to build out your property portfolio? Okay. So, and this is a strategy that both Nathan and I have implemented, and we've purchased multiple properties over the last 10, 15 years utilizing the exact same strategy. And there's a couple of different moving parts which we'll run through in a tick as well.
Because I think, and everyone can sort of attest, getting into your first investment property, the hardest thing is saving that deposit.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you chip away at it week on, week out, $500 into your bank account. You finally get to that level where you can put down your 10% deposit and get yourself into the property market. Then what we're really sort of working towards, and again, the strategy is to buy properties that are actually growing in value. You're failing if you're going the other way, but we're having properties that grow in value, and that allows us to recycle that equity so that we don't have to keep coming up with that 10% deposit, which again, if you're looking to build out a portfolio, it'd be next to impossible to come up with.
Well, that's it. If you've got to come up with a 10% deposit
every time around.
Yeah, a 10% deposit plus your stamp duty, legal fees, LMI.
Yep.
It takes X amount of years, let's say 5 to 6 years, you're buying a property once a decade. So using this strategy will expedite, the process, but obviously we've got to take calculated risks here as well. Okay. So what I'm going to do, guys, is work from left to right here. So what you've got is property number one, you've got value and cash deposit. So you as an investor, the first property, you have to put down a cash deposit. Okay, so there's no other way, ifs or buts about it, unless you go, a guarantor loan, but we'll ignore that. But essentially what you've got is there. Now, what actually happens over a given period of time is that property grows in value. And so you can see there you've got equity growth. In the example that Nathan ran through previously, there was equity or usable equity of $240,000, okay? So using that as an example, what we would then do is take out a loan for $240,000 and use that loan to actually then put a deposit, so you can see down the bottom there, equity deposit on a subsequent purchase. So you are no longer having to grind and save money, to try and come up with a deposit. And obviously as an investor or someone who's, maybe purchased, or considering purchasing, essentially you no longer need to come up with that 10%. The market is growing by 24, 25% in the last 12 months. Most individuals who have got real estate have got equity. So you take out that loan for $240,000 secured against property number one. You use that as a deposit on your next property, okay? We sit tight, watch that property grow, and then use the equity from property number two, potentially, to then fund the deposit via an equity deposit on property number three. Now, what we're doing, guys, is you're not putting down cash. You're actually borrowing the full purchase price, because really you've just got, you're using a loan to fund a deposit on the subsequent purchase. Now, what smart investors need to do, and what we focus on quite heavily, is two things. You need to ensure you're investing in an area that's got tremendous potential for capital growth. That's very, very important. But importantly as well, you need to ensure that you're purchasing properties that are high yielding. The reason being is that as you borrow more and more money, which investors, we always do that to build our portfolios, you need to ensure that you've got sufficient cash flow in place to comfortably, continue to fund the growth of the portfolio. And the way we do that is we make sure that the rental yields are very, very strong.
Yeah, and it's a good point, because it's all well and good that we have growth in the property market. That obviously helps us out with the deposit for the second property. But banks will look at two things when you purchase an investment or when you purchase a property. It's the deposit amount, but it's also that serviceability. So they'll take into account your current income, so what you do for a job, how much money you're making, but they'll also take into account the rental income that you've received from your other previous properties or your previous purchases. And then what they do is put into their system to spit out a percentage ratio. And what they're looking for is how much income you're using to paying back debt. So eventually you'll get to a stage where you will tap out and you've got to pay back that debt. But initially we want to be able to leverage obviously the equity, and we want to make sure that we've got the cash flow, the rental yield to support our ability to continue to borrow.
So yeah, and I mean, look, what we're ideally wanting to do as well is when you build out a portfolio, we've got cumulative growth that we're looking to achieve. So now, you've got growth not on just one property, but on multiple properties over a given period of time.
Yeah, compounding effect.
Exactly right. Alrighty, so we now know what equity is. Equity is a difference between what you owe and what the property value is. We know what usable equity is. We know how it's used to basically then subsequently purchase additional properties via a loan. But obviously, in order to access that equity, you need to get a valuation on your property done.
So a lot of people ask, like, obviously, what is a valuation? How do I go about getting one? And who actually does them? So you'll typically find that valuations get thrown around, either a bank valuation, or you could even get a valuation from a real estate agent. Now, because the real estate agent isn't actually lending you the money, unfortunately, their word isn't going to stand for too much. So we need to go back to the bank, because they're the ones that are going to be lending us the money. So if you currently own a property, then what you'd be looking at doing is speaking to your mortgage broker or going into the lender that you're with and organising a bank valuation. Now, typically most lenders will do them for free. Some will charge. We can navigate that with you, but they'll do one of three valuations on the property. So first valuation they can potentially do is a full valuation. Now, that's probably the most in-depth valuation, and that's where a valuer will actually pop out to your property. If it's tenanted, they'll need access by the property manager and tenants, and they'll go through the property and they'll take notes on how many bedrooms, aspects, improvements, pretty much the ins and outs of it. They'll go around the local area and they'll basically, give you a valuation based on what they feel your property's worth in the current market. The second type of valuation is a curbside valuation. So this is where the valuer may drive out to the property, won't necessarily need to go into the property. They can either run off a contract or they may have photos from previous listings, etc. They'll drive around the local area, look at some comparable sales, look at the comparable houses along your street and come up with a valuation that way. And then the third way they run valuations, and quite common these days just because of obviously the workflow that a lot of the banks are working with. COVID, obviously a lot of valuers not going into people's houses, and it's via a desktop valuation. So again, a bit of a lazier way, but the banks run with CoreLogic and RP data. So they have up-to-date sales pretty much daily. So what they do is put all your property details into their systems, and that will sift through all the current sales, all the previous sales for the last 3 months. And then that will determine a property valuation for you. Now, keeping in mind, obviously with valuations, you can have a range of values come back depending on the valuer. And in particular with these 3 types of valuations, you could have a desktop valuation come in a lot higher than we were expecting or a lot lower. Comes back down to the system that they're using. We can then also have a valuation where it's a full valuation where the valuer may turn around and be having a bad day. Valuation could come in short on the property, depending on what day he goes out to see your property, or it could come in quite high. So it becomes a little bit of a game, particularly three types of valuations and where your valuation is going to come in at.
And look, the lender themselves we can't ask for any specific valuation. Essentially, it goes into a system and then the lender determines what they want to do. Typically, what they try to do is, because lenders have to pay for valuations, they'll try to do a desktop. If the system doesn't allow them a desktop, they'll try to organise a curbside. If the curbside's still not sufficient, they'll go to a full. So it is, a bit of a game that we play with those valuation companies.
Lucky dip, I like to call it.
Exactly right. All right. So again, Nathan touched on it briefly, but again, this is an independent valuer. So the bank actually employs valuation companies, and basically they go out and look at the location, the zoning, planning restrictions, the size, bedrooms, bathroom, living areas, the structure, condition, fixtures, fittings, vehicle access, recent sales, areas for improvement, and they put it all in a report. So, there's a lot of different factors that get taken into consideration. And again, if a valuer doesn't like an area, I can assure you now, you're going to get a valuation that's a little bit less. And then you might go to another bank and the valuer loves the location. And again, it's unfortunately meant to be impartial, but realistically, it's an individual person's perspective of what they believe a property is worth.
And what you'll typically find as well, it comes back down to the recent sales of similar properties in the area. So again, if you're an area that's newly established, it'll take time for those settlements or those resales to occur, and for those, comparable sales to come online, because the banks have to use sales within the last 6 months. So they can't be using sales or comparable sales from 2 years ago.
Or from other areas.
For other areas, yeah. And it needs to also be like for like. So again, they can't turn around and compare your 4-bedroom home to say a 2-bedroom home and work out the difference. It has to be 4-bedroom, like for like, apples with apples.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so why are valuations important when we're actually trying to determine the equity? Well, they actually tell you exactly what the bank believes your property's worth in their eyes. So how much can we actually borrow? How much equity can we actually access? Now, in saying that, different banks, like we mentioned previously, are going to have different valuations. So something both Nathan and I do, which drives our mortgage broker crazy, is we're always looking for the bank that's going to give us the best valuation on our investments. And we, have no allegiance to any specific bank because we want to make sure that we've got, we're basically going with the lender that has given us the best valuation, and therefore we can access that equity to subsequently purchase another property. Again, it's something that's really, really important to be agile. The reason being is, let's say, for example, 24 months ago, you were with ANZ. ANZ came out and undervalued your home, and you could have gone with Commonwealth Bank and drawn out $200,000 of equity. You would have missed out on the last 24 months of growth. So it's really, really important to remain agile and nimble and be able to adapt, remembering that the banks are lending you money. so you can build your portfolio and build wealth. You're not giving them money.
Yeah, and case in point, I had valuations done about 1.5 years ago now on my property in Sanssouci. Valuation done in end of November, start of December. Valuation there came in at 900,000, and then start of January, so about 1.5 months later, second valuation through another company, and it came back at 1.2. So there was a jump of $300,000 over the space of 2 months. Great Christmas present, but realistically, the property market hadn't moved that quickly. But that's a good example of the difference between, whether you've got the ability to then leverage into another investment property. In my case, I did, but you can sort of see you've got to shop around. The banks are never going to work for you. So it's really sort of, as Josh said, being agile and being mindful that even with interest rates, always check your interest rates. Banks do bounce around. They change their policies. It might be Westpac today is focusing on investors, so they've got really attractive rates for investors. It may be that their portfolio becomes too heavily reliant on investors in a year's time. They start to offload investors looking for owner occupiers, and then their whole interest rate base will change again. And it may be more viable for you to be sitting with Commonwealth. So again, as Josh sort of said, every sort of 12, 24 months, have a chat to your mortgage brokers, have a chat to us, and
Absolutely.
just make sure that you continually basically giving your mortgage a bit of a health check because you want to make sure that you're obviously saving as much as you can because it's money in your back pocket.
Exactly right. And look, we've ran through it previously, but obviously, again, valuation can differ from lender to lender. Nathan ran through the scenario with himself, but obviously we've had clients in a similar position where we've gone and had 2 valuations ordered, and it's not uncommon to have, in some instances, between $30,000 and $250,000 difference between like different institutions. I'm in a constant battle, with valuers with my own personal portfolio. But again, it's about remaining agile and nimble and making sure that, if there's equity there and the lender is willing to lend you the money to do it, then, you utilize that. That money it'd be like keeping cash in the bank, guys. At the moment, we know that the interest rates, you're not getting a good return on your money. Consider the equity as cash. You need to be able to, at every possible moment, disperse the equity to continue to build the portfolio out.
Correct.
Alrighty. So, look, with regards to determining your equity, like we've mentioned previously, the first and foremost, we need to organise a bank valuation. So that's really, really important. So we can assist with that. We're not mortgage brokers, but we've got a panel of recommended mortgage brokers right around the country that can organise that for you free of charge. Okay, so 99.9% of banks will pay for that valuation for you, so there's absolutely no cost. That will then allow us to determine how much equity you have to be able to invest in a second, third, or even fourth property if you're lucky. But there's another thing that you need to take into consideration as well, and that's obviously your ability to service it.
Correct. Yes, yeah. We alluded to that before. And then the other thing as well, even with unlocking the equity, so we've now come into a period of the market where we've all had significant growth. You don't need to take the equity out and use it straight away. Obviously, there's a great opportunity to do so, but we can also go through the process and park that equity or that additional funds available into the offset account, so it's ready to deploy. Particularly in a marketplace like this where, you might have a little bit of a stagnant period. The banks may become a little bit conservative with interest rates. Great opportunity to rip that money out so that it's liquid in your offset account and ready to deploy.
Yeah, and look, the thing is, with regards to, continuing to build your portfolio, we're, off topic before we go to questions, but we have had clients say, hey, Josh, what's the deal with interest rates rising? What's the deal with the federal election? Put simply, when we kind of break it down, whether you bought during the Howard era or the Keating era, 20 plus, 25 years ago, again, 25 years later, you're still in a positive position. It doesn't really, to a certain extent, it does matter, but obviously in the long term, properties always should be held as long-term assets, so it doesn't really matter. Interest rates historically have always sat, at probably 6.5%. they're sitting at the lowest it's been for since records were kept. So will it go back to 6.5%? I personally don't think so. I think the new norm is cheap money, but it will need to go up. So what you need to do as an investor is realize, hey, there still will be opportunity in the future. We need to make sure we're taking actionable steps now to secure that equity and obviously as well as that continue to build out a portfolio.
And that's where we go back to as well, just making sure that it's cash flow positive in terms of your investment decisions and that it's got a decent yield sitting at, 4 to 6%, because interest rates will bump at the moment. They're sitting around the 3% mark, but they'll more than likely get up closer to the 4%.
Absolutely will.
So as long as we're sitting in between that 4 and 6%, that at least you've got rental income covering the cost of holding your asset.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you guys. Like I said, we said we were going to keep it nice and short and sweet. So I'm happy to sort of run through any questions via the chat if you've got any to run through with regards to equity, how it works, and kind of even some commentary around, where we see the real estate market moving. Don't be shy, guys. We can't bite over the screen. Thank you, Matteo. Alrighty. Just want to confirm you. All right, great questions, guys. So Stephen, just want to confirm, using the equity, do you take out a second loan or do you refinance the original loan? So what we want to do is we want to keep all the loans separate. The reason being is that you want to take out a second loan and actually differentiate the purpose of the loan. So you want to go, hey, this second loan is actually for property number 2. You know what I mean? So if you actually just refinance and top it all the way up, you're actually mixing the debt. So between property 1 and property 2. So what we want to do is basically take out a secondary loan and then utilize that secondary loan as a deposit on the next property. And so, for example, you'd say, hey, this is, a Sydney property. And then you've got, the equity loan being, hey, Sydney property number 2. So what you want to do is be able to differentiate the loans. Your accountant will thank you for that. You want to keep it, very, very
Mixing debt, particularly when it comes to depreciation and tax breaks on each of the individual properties.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Can you use the LMI from your first property on a second? Unfortunately not, Josh. So essentially, lender's mortgage insurance is paid once. And it's paid to obviously the lender, because what they're doing is they're taking on some additional risk because you haven't got the required 20% deposit. What you will find though is that if you're, and again, this again depends on lender to lender, if you've made a little bit of growth, let's say 10%, in many instances, you'll be able to top up the loan back up to 90% and not pay lender's mortgage insurance a second time, because you've paid it once already. Now it does depend on lender to lender. So, high levels.
And that is staying with the same lender.
Yeah, so staying with the same lender. So let's say, for example, you took out a 90% loan on a property. The property's gone up in value by X amount of dollars. You can top the loan typically back up to 90% and not pay any more mortgage insurance depending on the lender. So you can technically, in some instances, use LMI, or utilize the LMI
because we're not mortgage brokers.
Yeah, but we have done it, multiple times, and we've seen it happen. So thanks, Kevin. Thanks for joining. All righty. If an income is a certain amount, how about the case when exceeding borrowing capacity? So, if an income is a certain amount, how about the case when exceeding borrowing power?
I'm not sure I'm following that one.
Yeah. So, LW, if you could elaborate, that'd be great. So, I think you're probably trying to refer to essentially how
do you increase your borrowing capacity or borrowing power, with income. So essentially it's one of two ways. You either get a higher paying job or we start to increase our rental income. So again, any sort of income that you've got coming through or you're declaring, when we put our pay slips into the bank, when we turn around, if we have a secondary job, secondary income, We've made money, obviously through our rental income, bumped it up by $20, $30, $40. That all contributes to your serviceability with the banks, and that will generally increase. The other way to obviously increase your borrowing power is if you start to pay back down debt.
Yeah, correct.
That's pretty much the only two ways you can increase your borrowing capacity. Or third, if you are single, if you turn around and do find somebody else, you can then merge your borrowing capacity. So two people buying a property together obviously increases your borrowing capacity.
Yeah.
So that's the other third way to go about it, to borrow more money.
Absolutely. Thanks, Akash. Sanjaban, so to get investment loan, is rental income is important or salary? Look, it's really both. So you need to make sure that you are generating a substantial rental income. The reason being is it's going to hinder your ability to continue to build out your portfolio. So if you're earning, if your investment is not performing very, very well, so let's say you're borrowing the money, Sanjaban, at like 3.5% from the bank, but you're only getting a 2% rental return, which is typically what we're finding in Sydney at the moment. You're covering the difference. You're borrowing the money at 3.5%, but you're only getting 2% as a rental return. You're coming up with the difference. That's going to hinder your ability to purchase more real estate, because the bank then goes, oh, well, you're having to come up with $500 a week to support that current property. So what then happens is when you go to buy another property, they go, great, you've got a ton of rent equity, but we can't lend you any more money. So it's really, really important to make sure that you're generating as much rental income as possible. And then subsequently as well, it is important to have a salary as well. So if you can avoid, so Josh again, so if you can avoid LMI in the first instance, is it best? Look, I don't believe so, and I'm going to tell you why. Okay, so what you'll find, and let's use the last 24 months as an example. If you as an investor only had, 50 grand in savings, for example, and you're able to squeeze yourself into the property market and pay LMI, you would have experienced 26% growth on that property, which is exceptional. What you would have done, unfortunately, if you were trying to avoid LMI is, and let's say that LMI, for example, is $5,000, Josh. So what you would have done alternatively is you would have had to save for another year. And then what you would have found is that the property market would have run away from you because it was growing, and it will continue to grow quicker than most people can save. So I pay LMI on every single one of my purchases because I want to put down as little cash as possible to recognize the growth that you're going to be achieving in the long term. So I disagree that LMI, I love paying LMI because it means that if I've got a pool of money or a pool of equity, I can spread it across multiple properties versus, kind of putting it all into one.
Yeah, and it's a common, thing that pops up with particularly a lot of first-time investors, because it's generally parents that push the, the information out where you need to make sure that you have a 20% deposit so you avoid the lender's mortgage insurance. Now, as Josh sort of said, you're better off looking at leveraging and having two properties compounding and experiencing growth with, say, 50,000 a piece than putting the $100,000 into the one property. Yes, you're going to save yourself maybe $10,000 in LMI, but you're also not going to have the growth on two properties. It'll be the one. So again, net result, you're going to be better off. And as Josh sort of said, you want to be able to keep your money liquid. So the less we have to put down, the better.
And the thing is as well, is when our parents, were buying their properties, what you actually found is that it was also an 18% interest rate. So you wanted to put down the biggest deposit possible because there was a fair bit of interest that you're actually paying. In the current environment, the interest rate's sitting very low, and yes, it will. Yeah, money's cheap, but it will go up. But it's still not going to hit that 18%. So it's much more benefit, paying that LMI. And not many people know this, but LMI is actually tax deductible. So you depreciate it at 20% of its value over 5 years. So you actually, let's say you pay, $10,000 in LMI, you actually have a $2,000 tax write-off for the 5 years you own the property. So again, you do get a pretty large proportion of it back as well. I hope that answered it, Josh. Thanks, Chester. All right, so LW, if the income's 120 and the total borrow capacity is 1 million, if the first home borrowed is 900,000, there's no way to borrow more for a second house. Yes, so unfortunately, you're at the moment, your equity is only sitting at $100,000 in that scenario. And so therefore you don't have enough equity to be able to subsequently borrow another house, a purchase for another house. So what you need to do is two things. Number one, you need to look at paying down debt. Alternatively as well, you need to look at, shopping that valuation around to multiple lenders to see if you can get a lender that will say, oh, actually, we don't believe it's worth 1 million. We're worth 1.2.
Yeah. So that was on equity side of things.
Yeah.
I think we're looking at the borrowing capacity there.
Mm.
But yeah, if your income sitting at 120,000 and your total borrowing capacity was $1 million, if you did go and borrow or buy a first home and you borrowed 900K, put down 100,000 for your $1 million purchase, what you typically find is that you would have borrowing capacity again, because when you went back to the bank for the second property, you would now have rental income on that initial purchase, which would bump up your borrowing capacity again slightly. But because you have taken on that much debt first time round, what you find is that your borrowing capacity won't be, anywhere near where you pretty much want it. It'll more than likely sit at, 300,000-400,000 for a secondary purchase. But yes, they will now take into account where your initial purchase would have been 120,000 in income flat. You're now looking at 120,000 income plus your rental income, which would then bump your servicing up slightly.
Perfect. Hi, Deborah. Thanks for your question. What's the usual interval between buying investment properties while building a portfolio?
Depends if you win lotto.
No, look, essentially we're finding that most of our clients, depending on a couple of different factors, their borrowing capacity, as well as that the equity, normally we're able to assist them in about kind of 12 to 18 month period. So even for Nathan and I, being active and aggressive investors, we're very bullish. And we kind of buy through various property cycles, even, kind of middle of COVID as well. What we find is that, if you take into account your income, the debt that you're paying down in equity, you should be able to do that comfortably in a 12 to 18 month period. The disclaimer is eventually you will hit a ceiling. We all will. So unless you're Bill Gates, you will hit a ceiling where the bank won't lend you any more money. Or alternatively, you need to pay down some debt in order to borrow some more.
Correct.
All righty. All right, Yen, normally the bank's assessed borrowing capacity of the second property is lower than the first one. How to get a second assessment higher or at least the same for the first property? So not necessarily, Yen. So what you'll find is that with a second property, and let's say you own your own home and then go and buy an investment property, the banks will take into account negative gearing, they'll take into account rental income, and they take into account your own personal income. So with regards to getting a higher assessment, there's certain lenders that have got reduced cost of living standards. There's certain lenders that prefer self-employed people. There's certain lenders that are more comfortable with a lower loan, a higher equity amount. So it really just depends on the individual lender. We're not mortgage brokers, but what we can do is certainly refer you to someone that we know can make it work. But yes, it is, more difficult. However, again, if you're in the right area and getting the right yield, it certainly can happen.
The other thing is that particularly with lenders, you have what we call tiered lenders. So you have tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 lenders. Typically, your major banks, your ANZs, NABs, Commonwealth are tier 1 lenders. So their policies are a little bit tighter. You then may go and look at a secondary lender or a tier 2 lender, which is your Bank West, your Bendigo banks. They will typically be a little bit more flexible in terms of how much they'll let you borrow because they're looking for business. And then you may look at third tier lenders. Now, third tier lenders, you might start touching once you do get to that position where your borrowing capacity is a little bit lower. They're a little bit more lax again, and they will typically be your lenders like your Pepper Money, Latrobe. So again,
but in saying that, the interest rate will be higher.
The interest rate, yeah.
Absolutely.
So again, it's just depending on your situation, and that's obviously why you'd sit down with a mortgage broker, because they can access all sort of 30 lenders and work out with your situation which is going to be the most viable. But as we sort of said earlier, not all banks are the same. So it's really sort of working out which ones, and you will more than likely find as you build out your portfolio, you may start with NAB, your second investment may need to be with Adelaide Bank, and then your third one may need to be with Latrobe. So it really just depends on which lenders are going to be the most viable as you progress through your property portfolio.
And look, they can always be refinanced and restructured.
Correct.
So, All right, Josh, to use equity is the aim to positive gear properties so they pay for themselves. Look, we always prefer our properties to be cash flow neutral, so that they're absolutely paying for themselves. Look, in many instances, if you're too cash flow positive, you actually end up with a tax problem. So, do you want to get as much cash flow as possible? Absolutely. And yes, 99.9% of properties that we do recommend to our clients, we do have them paying for themselves.
Yeah, and we want to make sure that obviously that when they are cash flow positive, that they're cash flow positive, but they're also generating capital growth. So a lot of the time what you'll find is if your property or you buy into an area, for instance, where it starts off with really high cash flow or a really good yield, you'll normally find that you're sacrificing capital growth. That's why we normally sit with that neutral aspect where we've got the property or the rent actually covering the property holding costs, but we've also got that 4 or 5% growth. So we really want them to work parallel to each other, where again, we can continue to build the portfolio through our rental income coming through, but we're also getting that equity that we can recycle.
Yeah. Okay. And then we've got another question from Vu. I'm stuck on at a third property. I'm getting $150,000 of equity for 2 houses. That's great. Can you give advice to buy the next one? Can I withdraw from super for the investment? Look, at this stage, and I think there's some legislation or some policy being put forward by the Liberal Party with withdrawing super to buy your first home, so you won't be able to do it for an investment. With regards to, obviously the serviceability and your ability to buy a third property, a couple of things. Look, obviously, like we mentioned previously, you can shop around with different lenders. Depending on where your properties are, we're seeing vacancy rates sit at like 1% nationwide, like where, many of our clients are achieving, 30, 40, 50, 60, $100 a week rental increases. Now, if you're able to actually increase the rent on your, on those investments, that will also help your ability to continue to build your portfolio. Look, it is a bit of a brutal chat to have with, the tenant, but essentially you as an investor need to make sure that you're continuing to obtain market value for your investment. And if the real estate agent tells you, hey, you've got to charge them extra $100 a week, you need to do that with confidence. We had that instance where a couple of clients said, oh, look, we actually didn't increase the rent. We felt sorry for the tenants. Look, again, being here to help investors, that's great. But at the same time, everyone around you is charging significantly more. So look, my advice would be obviously to shop around and talk to a couple of different lenders. But as well as that, Vu, you need to look at bringing up the rent. And again, I think something like 95% of properties have had a rental increase in the last 12 months. So that will help your borrowing capacity tremendously. Something like a $10 increase on a weekly basis is, leads to, I think, something along the lines of a 15 times increase in your borrowing capacity. So, it does, kind of all add up in the scheme of things.
Yeah, and just definitely, as we sort of said, chat to the mortgage broker that you're working with at the moment, because they will be able to start to look at different lenders, and particularly in this sort of a market, there are lenders coming out with new policy pretty much daily. So you may be able to find yourself where initially you were looking at, say, tier 1 or tier 2 lenders, potentially a tier 3 lender where, as Josh sort of said, you might be paying a little bit higher of an interest rate, but if you're buying the right property with the, slightly higher rental yield, it may very well offset that.
Not only that, like we've had so many instances where clients have had to pay a premium on their interest rate because they're not the best, kind of bank applicant, and it worked out, hey, the interest was an extra $6,000 a year. But in the last 12 months, they made $100,000 of growth on that property. So, it was worthwhile. So it is about making smart moves. And look, again, it's about moving forward. So again, if there's an opportunity for you to move forward and continue to grow, you need to make educated decisions with regards to if it's suitable for you, and the, risk versus reward.
And just before we go as well, I was talking about it before, but when we look at debt, a lot of people obviously are a little bit hesitant in terms of leveraging and buying a second and a third property. But I always go back, and you said it best, where if your parents had bought a property, say 20 years ago and borrowed $100,000 for that property, and at the time the property was worth $120,000, okay? Now, if they had bought that one property and we fast tracked to now and they hadn't paid any debt down, so the debt's still sitting at $100,000, they're on an interest-only loan amount. That property's gone from 120,000 to whatever it would be today.
$1 million,
probably
whatever it
$1
is.
million. Their debt is still sitting at $100,000. So yes, they've had to chip in obviously to cover the interest repayments, and their rent would have covered a partial amount of that. But realistically, that property skyrocketed. Now, I guarantee if you speak to your parents, they probably wish if they had the opportunity again that they had bought 3 or 4 properties. And then if you've got that compounding growth factor, yes, your debt levels are sitting here, but they're not actually increasing. So your debt levels will remain, your property is actually increasing in value. And that's what we're really trying to unlock, so that you've got 2, 3, 4, 5 assets, 10, 20, 30, 40 years down the track, where the growth will shoot up. Your debt levels remain the same. We slowly chip away at them. And that's obviously how we work towards that, that portfolio approach.
Yep. No, absolutely. And look, and that's the thing, guys. And, you know, with the current, just to, on a side note before we wrap up, in the current, you know, environment, economic landscape, obviously we're seeing inflation. So what you've got to remember as an investor is your debt is not linked to inflation. Okay. So your debt is not increasing in line with inflation. Your debt, hopefully you're either making the payments, if not chipping away at it, but the value of the bricks that goes into building your house, the mortar, the timber, the steel is increasing. So essentially what you'll find is that, you know, yes, we're borrowing more money, but your debt is not increasing in line with inflation. Your debt's staying the same, but your assets and the cost of everything else is increasing around you. So again, it's a very bullish approach towards investing. Nathan and I have always got that mindset, but essentially, yes, you know, your debt is not going to be increasing. So it's actually not a bad time to have debt, because if you've got cash sitting in the bank, it's worth significantly less. So,
Yes.
All right. So with Yen, so with investment properties, is it interest only better? I'll let you take this one away.
It really just depends on your situation and strategy. So with my portfolio, I've got different properties on interest only. I've got others on principal and interest. Typically, if you've got your own home, you'd want to put that on principal and interest because it's non-tax deductible debt, and you'd want to park your investment properties on interest only so that you can focus paying down your own home. And then once that's done, that's when you turn around and focus on your investment properties. Because again, as we've said earlier, your investment properties are all tax deductible debt. So it's good debt, your own home, non-tax deductible, not bad debt, but it's not beneficial for your tax situation. So again, focusing on that. If you do have multiple investments, again, you know, people will put their loans on interest only to tidy up their cash flow. So if you're sort of struggling with your, you know, cost of living, it may be an opportunity to put your property on an interest-only loan to obviously bulk up your cash flow. If you're looking at leveraging into a second property, could also be a good opportunity to put the property on an interest-only loan for 3, 4, 5 years, so that you can also fast track your savings. So build up that second deposit by your next investment property. But again, really just depends on your situation and what you're looking at doing. Keeping in mind that interest-only loans can only go for a maximum of 5-year period. You can always refinance and extend it, but only for a 5-year period, and then revert back to 25 years on principal and interest, which will mean you're paying a little bit more once that principal and interest kicks in. And then I guess alternatively, what you'll sort of find is that with interest rates, typically the banks will be a little bit more favorable in terms of their rates towards principal and interest home loans. So you'll pay a little bit more of a premium to have your home loan on an interest-only basis.
And then a big disclaimer, guys, obviously, is it
We are not mortgage brokers.
mortgage brokers, and we don't provide credit advice, but that's obviously just from our opinion, what we've seen and what we've done for ourselves personally. So, all righty. Look, if there's no other questions, I just want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. You know, please reach out to us if you do want to organize a valuation, if you want to know more about equity, if you want to look at kind of continuing to build out your portfolio. You know, we want to thank you all for entrusting us, you know, potentially future clients, and we've got plenty of present clients here today for taking on this journey where we're looking forward to, you know, working with you and getting these things sorted.
Yeah, and anyone that put questions through that or had questions that may not have wanted to put it into the chat, feel free to drop us an email, drop us a line, and we're happy to help.
Awesome, guys. Thank you very much. Have a great evening. Thank you for joining us.